The crash shattered the stillness of the mountain road just after dawn. A mist hung in the trees like breath held in waiting, and the twist of metal came sharp and sudden, echoing through the ravine. Birds scattered. Gravel skittered down the embankment where the SUV now lay on its side, wheels spinning in the air like a dying heartbeat. Clara Addison hadn't planned to drive that road that morning. She wasn't supposed to be up there at all. She was running late for her shift at the small clinic on the outskirts of town, and the shortcut was barely a road, more of a suggestion etched into the hills by decades of old trucks and stubborn locals. But she had a feeling, the kind that settled low and restless, the kind she'd learned never to ignore since life had taught her how fast everything could change. She saw the wreckage just past the curve, the smell of gasoline and pine hanging heavy in the air. Instinct carried her out of her car before her thoughts could catch up. The vehicle had rolled, that much was clear, the windshield shattered, the frame crumpled around the driver's side. Smoke hissed from beneath the hood. She crawled down the slope, palms scraping over bark and moss, until she reached the door. Inside was a man, unconscious, face streaked with blood, breathing shallow but steady. She didn't know him, not yet, but something about him made her pause. There was a calmness beneath the chaos, like he'd been holding on for her. She checked his pulse, cleared his airway, murmured to him as she worked, her hands moving with the precision of years spent in quiet urgency. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're going to be all right." When the paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, she was still holding his hand. His blood stained the sleeves of her sweater, and her own knuckles were raw from clawing at the door until it gave way. They loaded him into the ambulance, and Clara didn't follow. She stood in the mist, staring after the flashing lights until they vanished down the road. Back at the clinic, her shift blurred around the edges. She couldn't stop thinking about the man in the SUV. His face lingered in her memory like something almost remembered, like a song half heard in another life. It wasn't until 3 days later that she found out who he was. The nurse at the hospital had mentioned him in passing, Darren Cole, CEO of Cole Medical Systems, admitted with a head injury and broken ribs. He'd regained consciousness that morning, but they were monitoring him closely for signs of memory loss. She'd nodded, heart fluttering with a recognition she couldn't quite place. That night, curiosity pulled her toward the hospital. She told herself she just wanted to check in, maybe see if he was recovering, maybe ease the ache that had settled in her since the crash. He was sitting up when she peeked through the doorway. His arm was in a sling, gauze wrapped around his head, but his eyes were sharp, tired, guarded. She stepped into the room. "Hi," she said, soft as the lamplight. "I was the one who found you." He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face. "You were there." "I pulled you out of the car," she nodded. "You were unconscious." A flicker of something passed through his gaze. Gratitude, perhaps, confusion. He shifted slightly. "Thank you, I guess I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," she said quickly. "I was just in the right place at the right time." He held her eyes then, and she felt the weight of his attention like warmth in a cold room. "You're a nurse." "I am," she answered. "What's your name?" "Clara Addison." He went still. The silence thickened between them. His expression didn't change, but something in him tightened, a nearly imperceptible retreat. "I think," he said carefully, "we've met before." Clara felt it then, the drop in her stomach, the way memory reached back with a sting. His voice, clearer now, hit a note she hadn't heard in years. She remembered the glass offices and the white corridors of Cole Medical Systems. The letter delivered to her locker. No meeting, no warning, just a dismissal. Restructuring, they'd said. Budget cuts, but she knew the truth. She made too many waves, spoken too openly. Questioned things that weren't supposed to be questioned. She'd been fired, and now here he was, lying in a hospital bed, thanking her for saving his life. "I used to work for your company," she said, voice low. A pause. "What department?" "Pediatric trauma." Something in him shifted. He blinked once. "I'm sorry, I don't remember." Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's all right," she said. "Most people don't remember the people they let go." He flinched at that, just slightly, as if something sharp had brushed against a raw edge he didn't know was there. She turned to leave. "Wait," he said, "why did you save me?" Clara paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. "Because someone was hurt," she said, "and I'm not the kind of person who walks away from that." She didn't wait for his reply. Outside, the night was quiet, the wind carrying the promise of rain. Her car sat where she'd left it, and as she slipped behind the wheel, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She had saved the man who had ended her career, and he didn't even remember doing it. But fate wasn't finished with them yet. The next time Clara saw Darren, it wasn't by choice. She was on her way to the orthopedic wing to check in on a teenage boy recovering from surgery. The hospital had been short-staffed lately, and Clara often volunteered to take on extra cases quietly without praise. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and rain-dampened coats, and just as she turned the corner, she nearly collided with a man moving slowly, leaning slightly on a cane. It was him. They both froze. Darren recovered first, a polite smile tugging at his lips. Clara. Her name sounded different when he said it now, like he'd practiced it, like it wasn't a passing detail anymore. Hi, she said, steadying the clipboard against her chest. I've been hoping I'd run into you, he said, shifting his weight off the cane. I wanted to thank you again properly. You already did. He tilted his head. Still, I didn't get to ask how you ended up there that morning on that road. I could ask the same of you. He smiled faintly, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Business trip, early morning meeting in Sanderton. I didn't want to take the highway. Shortcut, she said. Wrong kind of shortcut. For a moment they stood there, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above them, a silent truce between two people who weren't sure if they were supposed to be on opposite sides. Then Clara glanced down the hall. I should get to my patient, she said. Of course, Darren nodded, but would you have coffee with me when you're free? Clara blinked. You want to have coffee with the nurse you fired. He winced. I still don't remember doing that. I've looked into it. HR told me it was during the restructuring phase and I signed off on a lot of names. Too many, it wasn't personal. Clara gave a quiet laugh, dry and low. It never is. But something in her hesitated, not forgiveness, she wasn't there yet, but curiosity. I'll think about it, she said, and walked away before he could answer. Clara didn't say yes right away, she didn't say no either. For the next 2 weeks she saw Darren occasionally in the hospital cafeteria, outside on the benches, sometimes in physical therapy. He always gave her space. Sometimes he nodded if they passed in the corridor. Sometimes he didn't see her at all, distracted by a nurse adjusting his sling or a visitor asking directions. It was strange watching him from a distance. He moved like a man relearning the world, slower, more careful, not the sharp-suited executive she'd remembered in the one meeting she'd dared speak up in. Back then he'd seemed untouchable. Now he looked tired, real. He was also alone, no wife, no children, no steady stream of visitors. Clara asked one of the hospital aides once casually, and the answer came soft and apologetic: divorced, no kids, family on the East Coast, but none had flown in. He was recovering in a town that didn't quite know him anymore, and he didn't seem to mind the solitude. One gray Thursday afternoon, Clara found herself outside the cafe across from the hospital. It was small, warm, cluttered with plants and books left by patrons. She sat at the window and ordered chamomile tea. 5 minutes later, Darren stepped in. He spotted her immediately, gave a smile that held surprise and something gentler. Hi. I thought we could talk, Clara said, gesturing to the seat across from her. I don't like leaving things messy. He lowered himself into the chair, careful with his ribs. Neither do I. They talked. Not about the firing, not at first. They talked about the town, how he'd moved his company's second office here to get away from the pace of New York, how she'd grown up 2 counties over and only meant to stay in town for a year after her residency but never left. They talked about the strange peacefulness of mountain storms and how hospital vending machines never got stocked with the good chocolate. It was easy in a strange way. Natural. But eventually he asked, "Do you remember why you were let go?" Clara met his eyes. I asked questions. There were cost-cutting measures being taken in pediatric trauma, delays in equipment repairs, shortages in basic supplies. I documented everything. I brought it up in a meeting. I wasn't loud about it. I just didn't look away. He looked down at his coffee, and I didn't stop it. She didn't reply. He nodded slowly. I'm sorry, truly, for what it's worth. Clara studied him, not the apology, but the man offering it. He wasn't deflecting. He wasn't performing regret. He just looked worn. I don't forgive you, she said evenly, but I believe you're sorry. That's fair. They sat in silence for a while, letting the truth settle between them. It was heavier than either expected, but not unbearable. Eventually he said, I've been thinking about how strange it is. The way life throws things at us. You didn't have to stop that morning. You could have driven on. I've seen enough pain to know what it looks like from a distance, Clara said, and I know how it feels to be left behind. His eyes met hers then, something unreadable in their depths. You stayed with me. You needed someone. Darren's voice lowered, and now I need something else. Clara looked up. I need a second chance, he said, not just for what happened, for me, for the man I want to be now. Clara's fingers curled around her teacup, heart stuttering in a way she didn't expect. Not because she was ready, but because she wasn't sure she could ignore the part of her that wanted to be. You don't get second chances just because you ask for them. I know. But sometimes, she said, quieter now, you get one by becoming someone who deserves it. He nodded, I'd like to try. She watched him for a long moment, searching for cracks, insincerities, familiar arrogance. But all she saw was a man beginning again. The kind of beginning that only comes after a crash. The kind that changes everything. Darren didn't expect forgiveness overnight, he didn't even expect friendship. But something had shifted between them after that cafe meeting. It was subtle, unspoken, like the hush that settles just before rain. A space had opened, and they both seemed to understand it wasn't something to rush. He began to appear in small corners of Clara's days. Not deliberately, not in ways that drew attention. He volunteered at the hospital's patient transport desk a few mornings a week as part of his recovery, slowly building back strength. He asked questions of the nurses now, not just the doctors. He listened, observed, said thank you often. One morning, Clara watched him help an elderly man into a wheelchair, his movements careful and deliberate. She stood behind the glass wall of the nurse's station unseen, and something flickered inside her, not attraction, not yet, but a kind of quiet respect. He wasn't pretending, that mattered. She still didn't know what to do with the part of her that remembered the way her life had been derailed. The job she'd loved, the team she'd left behind, the humiliation of packing her things in silence. But when Darren caught her eye later that day, nodding once as if acknowledging both the moment and her place in it, she found herself nodding back. They began to talk more often. Never for long, sometimes in the hospital cafe when their breaks aligned, sometimes outside on the bench near the rose bushes that clung to life even in the bitter spring wind. Clara found herself speaking about things she hadn't said aloud in years, about her patience, her long shifts, the ache that came with carrying so many quiet heartbreaks. She spoke of the boy she couldn't save 2 years ago, the way his mother still came by the clinic with cookies for the staff. Darren never tried to fix anything, he just listened. He in turn spoke of the company he had once lived for, the way he'd built it from late nights and ambition. How somewhere along the way the purpose had slipped from his fingers, replaced by reports and quarterly projections. He told her about the day his wife left and how he hadn't chased her, not because he didn't care, but because he hadn't known how to stay. It's like I woke up, he said one afternoon, and realized I didn't like the man I'd become, and I didn't even know when it happened. Clara didn't respond at first, then she said, it happens slowly, that's what makes it so hard to notice. They looked at each other, a long, searching kind of gaze that neither of them turned away from. A month passed, then another. The town moved through spring toward summer and the trees unfurled themselves in celebration. The crash became something they rarely spoke of. What lingered wasn't the wreckage, but what had been born in its aftermath. Clara found herself wondering about Darren when she didn't see him for a few days. She thought about the way his voice softened when he talked about his mother, about how he lingered near the pediatric wing just to watch the children laugh. One evening he called. She answered on instinct, sitting on the porch of her small house with her feet tucked under a quilt. I wanted to ask something, he said, and you can absolutely say no. Clara smiled slightly. That's a dramatic opening. I'm trying to be respectful. Go on. There's a benefit dinner next week, he said. The hospital board hosts it. It's mostly boring speeches and cold fish, but they're raising money for the children's trauma wing. I thought maybe you'd come with me. There was a pause. I don't want to make this complicated, Darren added, but I'd like to be there with someone who reminds me what all this is supposed to be for. She closed her eyes for a moment, heart beating an old, cautious rhythm. All right, she said, but if the fish is bad, I'm blaming you. He laughed then, genuine, warm, and Clara felt something soften in her chest. The night of the benefit, Clara wore a simple navy dress and pulled her hair back in a low twist. She hadn't worn anything like it in years, not since her cousin's wedding. When she walked into the hotel ballroom, Darren was already waiting near the doors, looking freshly pressed in a dark suit, no tie, just enough of his usual crispness to feel familiar. You look, he began but didn't finish. He just smiled. Thank you for coming. The evening passed in a blur of handshakes and polite conversation. Darren introduced her to board members and doctors, to colleagues who looked surprised when they heard she used to work for Cole Medical Systems. He didn't try to hide it. He said her name like it meant something. Halfway through the dinner, during a lull in the speeches, Clara leaned over. I keep waiting for someone to ask me what I'm doing here. Darren looked at her and there was something unguarded in his expression. You're here, he said, because I wanted the person who pulled me out of a wreck to see what I'm trying to build from it. Clara looked down at her wine glass. It wasn't just a car crash, Clara, he said softly. It was my life, and you were the first person who didn't look at me like I was broken beyond repair. She was quiet for a long time, then she looked up and said, you just hadn't started healing yet. They sat with that. And somewhere between the last toast and the flickering of candlelight, Darren's hand brushed hers. Not deliberately, not insistently, just enough. She didn't pull away. Later, when he walked her to her car, the air was thick with the scent of blooming things. They stood near the open door, words lingering. I meant what I said, he told her. I want to build something better. Clara nodded, fingers resting on the doorframe. Just make sure it's something you can live with, not just sell. He smiled at that. Are we talking about the company or my life? Yes. He laughed again, and this time it was quiet and close, the kind of laughter people only share when they trust the silence that follows. Would you like to come by the site next week? He asked. They're breaking ground on the new trauma wing. I thought maybe you'd want to be part of it, since it's what you fought for. Clara hesitated. Then she said, I'd like that. And when he lined in, not quite for a kiss, but for something steadier, more grounded, she didn't flinch. She stayed. Not because she'd forgotten, but because some beginnings are born not from forgiveness, but from the courage to keep showing up anyway. The construction site didn't look like much yet, just dirt, scaffolding, and the low rumble of machinery carving out what would eventually become the new pediatric trauma wing. Clara stood with a hard hat in her arms, her scrubs still faintly wrinkled from a double shift. Wind tugged at strands of hair that had slipped from her ponytail. She wasn't supposed to be there, not officially. She didn't work for the hospital board, wasn't part of the planning team, but Darren had asked. And she'd said yes. He approached her from behind, wearing a white helmet and an old denim jacket that looked far too worn for a man who once had an office with a glass wall and a personal assistant who color-coded his schedule. You came, he said, a little breathless from walking across the gravel. Clara nodded. You said you wanted to show me something. He led her toward a fold-out table set off to the side of the site, where blueprints flapped under a paperweight and coffee steamed in a cardboard tray. They're keeping the layout open, more sunlight, private corners for families, a dedicated grief counselor on call. We've got local artists designing murals for the kids' recovery rooms. Clara scanned the plans, her eyes catching on the details she would have fought for years ago. You listened. I tried. She looked up at him. You've changed a lot. I had to, he said it quietly, almost like it still surprised him. The crash took more than my memory. It stripped everything back to bone, made me see what was left. Clara didn't reply right away. There were moments when she still didn't know how to reconcile the man standing in front of her with the one whose signature had erased her name from a list. But she also couldn't deny what she saw now, the effort, the ownership, the absence of excuses. As if sensing the weight of her silence, Darren added, I don't expect you to forget what happened. I just hope that maybe someday it won't be the only part of the story. A breeze lifted the edge of a tarp, revealing the foundation being laid. I don't forget, she said, but I do see this. That afternoon stretched into something soft. He walked her around the site, careful of uneven ground, explaining how every new detail had come from conversations with staff, nurses, technicians, even parents of patients. When she asked who brought the team together, he shrugged. Honestly, your name came up a lot. After what happened, people remembered what you said, what you tried to do. Clara blinked. That was years ago. Truth sticks to things, he said, even when people pretend it didn't happen. Their next few meetings weren't planned, not exactly. A coffee dropped off at her clinic desk on a rainy morning, no note, but she knew the handwriting scrawled across the cup. A book left in the staff lounge, poetry, gentle and aching, wrapped in brown paper. She found herself looking for him in doorways and reflections in quiet corners. He didn't push, he was just there. And slowly, impossibly, she let him be. One night, Clara stood in her kitchen, barefoot and exhausted, staring at the fridge and wondering whether oatmeal counted as dinner. Her phone buzzed with a message. You awake? She smiled barely. I'm sitting on my porch with a terrible bottle of wine and no one to drink it with. Thought of you. She stared at the screen for a moment, heart caught somewhere between suspicion and warmth. He hadn't asked for more than what they'd already shared. He wasn't presumptuous, but he was present. Be there in 20. His porch overlooked the hills in the distance, shadows pooling in the folds where the sun had already slipped away. Clara sat on the wooden step beside him, holding a glass of wine that did indeed taste like regret and vinegar. "This is terrible," she said, laughing. "I warned you." They sat for a while without speaking, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of understanding. Fireflies began to blink in the tall grass. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. "Do you ever miss who you were?" she asked suddenly. He didn't answer right away. "I miss the certainty," he said, "the illusion of control. I miss thinking I knew everything." She tilted her head. "You don't anymore." "I've learned the difference between power and purpose." He paused, then added, "And I think I like who I am now more than who I was then." She looked at him, really looked. "You should." He turned toward her, something hesitant and hopeful in his expression. "And you, do you still want to run every time you see me?" She smiled, slow and reluctant. "Not every time." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers, not asking, just offering. She didn't pull away. "I've been thinking," he said, voice softer now, "about what we could build, not just the trauma wing, but something different, you and me, something honest." Clara looked at their hands, at the way her fingers had unconsciously curled toward his. "I'm not looking for a fairy tale, Darren." "Neither am I." "I'm tired," she said, "of being the one who holds everything together. I don't want to be someone's redemption arc." His hand stilled. "You're not. You're the one who made me want to change. There's a difference." Clara swallowed the knot in her throat. The truth of his words stirred something deep, grief, hope, maybe both. "I'm still not sure." "That's okay," he said, "I can wait." She turned to him then, her gaze steady. "I don't want you to wait for me. I want you to live like you mean it, whether or not I'm standing next to you." He nodded, not hurt, not diminished. "Then I'll do that, and if you happen to be there one day, I'll be grateful." The night deepened around them, the stars stretched wide, no promises, just presence. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Summer settled into the hills with a kind of hushed grace, the days warm and gold-rimmed, the evenings thick with the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass. The trauma wing construction moved forward, steel and hope rising side by side. Darren had begun spending less time behind conference tables and more among the scaffolding, walking the halls that didn't yet exist. Clara kept her distance at first. She still worked long hours at the clinic, still offered quiet care to the ones who slipped through the cracks. She wasn't sure how to name what was happening between her and Darren. It wasn't a romance, not yet. It was too careful, too rooted in history and the ache of almost. But it wasn't nothing. She thought about him more often than she admitted. He showed up for her in ways she'd forgotten people could, without asking, without needing something in return. One Friday evening, she found a letter at the front desk, folded neatly under a clipboard. No name on the front, but she knew the handwriting. She read it alone in her car, parked beneath a maple tree heavy with green. "Clara, this isn't an apology. I think I finally said all the ones I owed you. This is something else, something I don't quite know how to say aloud. When you pulled me from that wreck, I didn't recognize your face, but I remember how it felt, being held by someone who didn't hesitate, someone who stayed. I didn't deserve it, not then. Maybe I still don't, but you did it anyway. You saved me, and now I find myself trying every day to be worth that moment. I don't know what's ahead, I don't expect anything from you. But if you ever want to build something quiet and steady, something that grows the way healing does, not fast but true, I'd stand beside you with everything I have left." They. Clara pressed the page to her chest and closed her eyes. There were no fireworks, no breathless declarations, just a truth spoken plainly, the kind that doesn't demand, the kind that offers. Weeks passed, the first walls of the trauma wing went up, tall and clean against the sky. Clara was invited to walk through it with the planning team. It was a ceremonial thing marking milestones. She almost declined. But that morning, something shifted. She walked through the frame of the building just after sunrise, when the construction crew was still pouring coffee and uncoiling cables. She traced her fingers along the unfinished doorway to what would soon be the intake room, then down the hall that would lead to recovery bays. There was no ceiling yet, but the light poured in freely. She stood there alone until she heard footsteps behind her. "Darren." He said nothing at first, just stood beside her and looked at the same space. "This was where I used to come," she said, voice low. "The part of the hospital that no one visited unless they had to, the place people rushed through." He nodded. "Now it'll be where people are seen." Clara turned to him. "I read your letter." His face didn't move. He looked at her carefully, like the moment might break if he pushed. I wasn't sure if you want to talk about it, he said. I do, her voice softened. You're not the man I worked for. That man wouldn't have written it, wouldn't have meant it. You're not him anymore. I'm trying not to be. She looked around at the beams, the light, the quiet promise of it all. I've spent a long time not letting people close, she said. Grief does that, so does betrayal, but I don't want to live my whole life behind the things that hurt me. He looked at her, not hopeful, just present, steady. I'm not asking you to cross any lines, Darren said. I just want to walk alongside you if and when you're ready. Clara reached for his hand, not because she decided anything final, not because everything was healed, but because in that moment her heart felt unarmored and true. I'm not ready, she said. That's all right. But I want to be. And that was enough. In the fall, the trauma wing opened. Clara was asked to speak at the small ceremony, standing before a crowd of hospital staff, donors, and families. She kept it simple. I used to think the hardest part of nursing was what we couldn't save, she said, voice clear and quiet. But I've learned that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins in silence, in the moments after pain, when someone chooses to stay. This wing is for those moments, for the beginnings we don't always recognize as beginnings. After the applause faded, she stepped down from the podium. Darren was waiting by the garden path. He didn't say a word, he didn't need to. They walked out of the building side by side, hands brushing, hearts cautious but open. And somewhere in the soft turning of the season, Clara understood something she hadn't before. Some endings come disguised as accidents, but every ending carries within it the seed of a choice. To start again, to forgive without forgetting, to love not in spite of the wounds but with them. And she had chosen. Not because he remembered, but because she did.